Well, thank you very much, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to all of you, wherever you are. I'm really enjoying these classes, and thank you for joining us for the third session. And I say wherever you are because people are joining this class from all over the world. Natasha, our technical colleague, was letting me know today where some of the people are from. I knew there was some folks obviously from across Canada, but also from America, from Australia, where I do a lot of work. Also, I hear from Ireland and from Kenya. So anyways, from those places and anywhere else that you're joining us, thank you for your energy and your attention. And I'm looking forward to the today's lecture and the rest of the session. So today, if you recall, in both the first two sessions, I have emphasized that the economy is not, charts and graphs and daily market updates from the stock market and even necessarily the quarterly GDP statistics from the Statistics Agency. The economy is the sum total of our work, that four-letter word. On Monday mornings in particular, it feels like a four-letter word. And it's our productive human effort, using our brains and our brawn to take the materials that we harvest from nature and transform them into useful goods and services. That is the economy. That is the driving force of the economy. And so today we're going to take a bit of a deeper dive into that four-letter word work and talk about how it's organized in our economy, some of the challenges that we face in doing our work and the relationships that are embedded in our workplaces, and then talk about a little bit of description about how Canada's labor market is functioning and what it looks like and some of the challenges that it faces going into the future. So I'm just going to call up my slides here, and Merle, just shout out that you see this title slide. Okay, economics for everyone. That's hopefully looking good for everyone.
Great, we can see it.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, so workers and bosses. It always seems that unless you're self-employed, you're going to go off and do your work. And in our economy, that means somebody's usually telling you what to do. And we'll talk about those relationships and how we negotiate them as individuals and what they imply for how the economy functions. Some of the key topics that we will cover today. We'll talk about work and production and review that work is the engine, the driving force in our economy. We'll talk about employment as one particular kind of work and the features of employment. We'll talk about how we work with tools, not with our bare hands. And we'll talk a little bit about companies and profit and so on, and how they are organized in our economy. We'll introduce this and we'll get more into it in detail in the next lecture. We'll talk about labor as a commodity and how labor is bought and sold in our economy and what that means, how it's different from other commodities. And then we'll talk about a concept that I'll introduce called labor extraction, which is how employers try to get the most bang for the buck from the labor that they hire and what that implies for different relationships, conflict and cooperation in the workplace. And then, as you know, I've spent most of my career as an economist working in the labor movement with trade unions. So I have a special interest in how do workers come together, given the nature of employment and the challenges on employment. How do they come together to try to get a better deal for themselves? These are some of the terms that we'll cover in this session today that are defined in that glossary. If you remember, there's an online glossary that goes with the textbook, Economics for Everyone, economicsforeveryone.ca. If you go there, there's an online glossary with short definitions of all these terms. If anyone wants to get a little bit more insight into some of the lingo that we throw around. So, we live in a capitalist economy. That's how we defined it last week. It's one form of economic organization. We know that human beings have evolved in terms of how we work and how we organize our work. So we've always had an economy, but the one that we live in today, we call the capitalist economy. It had two defining features. One of them is that most of the production, most of the work that takes place in the economy is organized through private businesses that are doing it in order to make a profit. And again, we'll talk more about those businesses and how they're organized and owned and financed and so on. The other defining feature of our economy is that most of the work that's done, certainly in the formal or for money part of the economy, most of the work that's done is done in the form of wage labor or paid employment. And this employment is just one form of work. There's lots of other ways that human beings work, including today, but employment is the dominant form of work in our economy. By employment, we mean you're working for someone else. You're doing that job, you're using your brains and brawn to produce something useful, but they're telling you what to do. They're directing you. They own the work that you produce. They own the value added that they produce, and then they pay you something in return for it. It could be an hourly wage, it could be a weekly salary, it could be tips, it could be a commission. That payment can come in all kinds of forms, but they're telling you what to do, and they're paying you for your troubles, paying you something for your troubles. And this is what we mean by employment or wage labor. And it is important to remember that it's not the only way that work occurs. It is one of the defining features of our economy. Most of the work in the paid in the formal monetary economy consists of employment, not all, but most of it. There are other types of work that go on. Most people are wage laborers as well. By this, I mean most people, through their life cycle, support themselves by doing paid work for someone else. It doesn't mean they're necessarily working all the time. There's lots of people who aren't working at different stages of their lives because they're not old enough yet, or perhaps they're going to university, or perhaps they're unemployed, or perhaps they've retired. At any given point in time, I'll show you the data later, something like 60% of adult Canadians are employed. But over their life cycle, the vast majority of Canadians, probably about 85%, rely on paid employment or wage labor as the way to support themselves through their life. So this is not the only form of work in our economy, but by far the dominant form of work in our economy. There are other ways that people do work, however, and this is important to keep in mind, that wage labor is not the only way that output is generated. That is not the only way that we use productive human labor to do stuff. It's also not the only way that people support themselves. So other forms of work that we see in our economy, paid employment or wage labor is where someone tells you what to do. Well, what about the people who are telling you what to do? How are they defined? If in fact it's the owner of the company that has hired you, or perhaps the top director or executive of the company, owners and top managers, they work, they make money, they do work if they're actually doing something on the job in terms of organizing production and managing and directing and solving problems. Sometimes the owners don't work, sometimes they just sit there and collect the profits, but in many cases they do work. They do that managerial and direction work at the top. That counts for a certain share of people. There's also a group of Canadians who are working for themselves, in essence. It isn't wage labor in the sense of going to a job and having someone else tell them what to do. They are actually running the business where they themselves, or perhaps members of their family, do most of the productive work. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of work that goes on in our economy. It might not be measured, it might not be captured in our GDP, but there's a lot of work that goes on that isn't paid at all. Unpaid work that occurs in our households, in our families, caring for children, caring for elders, maintaining the house, working in our communities, coaching soccer, or raising money for charity. Those are all forms of useful, productive work. They are not usually counted in our GDP statistics because our GDP statistics only count work and production that's done for money. This is a flaw in our GDP statistics. We should have better measures of the full spectrum of work and output that occurs in the economy. But it is an important part of our quality of life. It is an important part of our production and our consumption, whether it's measured in GDP or not. In the monetary economy, if we were to break this down, we would see that about 85%, as I mentioned, 85% of Canadians support themselves over their life cycle through paid employment. And then most of the unpaid work that goes on in our homes, so caring for our children, cooking meals, cleaning the house, washing the clothes, is related to getting people ready to go back to work the next day. It's called reproductive labor in economics. They say, you know, economists are a pretty dry lot. We can make almost anything boring even reproduction. Most people, when you think about reproduction, means having sex and having babies. For economists, they just make it dry and boring, and they talk about the reproductive labor that involves working your household and taking care of people and preparing them to go back to work. So if we count the 85% of people who work wage labor to support themselves over their life cycle, plus most of the unpaid work in our households, the reproductive work in our households is called taking care of people to get them ready to go back to work, then the vast majority of work that we do is either wage labor or getting ready to do wage labor. The other categories of employment are smaller. Perhaps about 15% of Canadians are self-employed in a genuine sense. That is, they run a small business or a farm or something else where they're genuinely the boss. There's lots of sort of fuzzy lines and confusion and controversy over how you define self-employment. We have seen various ways that businesses have tried to constitute people as self-employed who are actually wage laborers for all intents and purposes. A good example we see is in the gig economy these days. People who drive cars for Uber or deliver food for Uber Eats, the company says they are not our employees, they are self-managed independent businesses. Which, of course, for all intents and purposes, in practical terms, is nonsense. They are still directed where to go and how to do the job by Uber and by the app, and they get paid by Uber. They don't set their own prices, they don't do their own advertising, they don't set their own business strategies. So whether it's legally sustained that they're self-employed or not, the reality is they're not. They are doing a form of wage labor, a particularly insecure and precarious form of wage labor. But there are people who are genuinely self-employed, who do run their own business, who kind of have a venture that they dream of and organize. They do the work on it, and that's how they support themselves. Probably around 15% of adult Canadians. Then the group of people who do work, but they don't actually work for someone else, but they direct the work of others, owners and top managers of companies where most of the work is done by wage laborers, but those people themselves constitute a small share, perhaps 1 or 2% of the total labor market. So in our economy, most of the work that goes on is paid employment, and paid employment has certain features, certain characteristics that cause the economy to work in particular ways and cause workplaces to operate in particular ways. And most of the work, again, both paid and unpaid, is related to wage labor, including getting ready to go back and do wage labor again. So again, just to repeat my theme, throughout this course, the economy is the sum total of our work, where we use our brains and our brawn to transform what we harvest from nature into useful goods and services. And the dominant way that we do this in our economy, in a capitalist economy, is through wage labor. Now, in this regard, it's, again, both our physical labor and our mental labor. And I take a very inclusive view of work and workers. I think there's a kind of an old-fashioned and outdated idea that a worker, is someone who works with their hands, who's doing physical labor, who wears a blue collar, who may work in an industrial or outdoor setting. And we sometimes invoke other terms to refer to people doing jobs in other settings. I think those distinctions are pretty artificial. For sure, there are differences between the types of work that people do. Again, whether they're doing mostly physical labor or mostly mental labor or a combination of the two. There's differences in terms of the setting that people do their work in. Even if you work in an office, in most cases, you're still a worker. By my definition of employment, that means someone is telling you what to do and paying you for the work that you do. Even if you have a high university degree, even if you've got a graduate degree and you're very well trained, does that mean that you're not a worker? Well, if you're employed by an organization that tells you what to do and pays you for your services, then by this broad definition, yes, you are still a worker. Now, you may have an idea, I'm a professional, you may think that you're better than other workers who work mostly with their hands and their bodies, but the reality is you're still being paid to do something for someone else. They still own the value that you create with your work. And by the way, you can still be let go when your work isn't required. So even if you work in an office and you have a higher degree and you wear a suit and you call yourself a professional, you're still involved in employment and you still experience the challenges and risks of being employed. Same is true again whether you're working in the private sector or in the public sector. I mentioned about 85% of our economy is production by for-profit private firms, but there's 15% that happens through other channels, including government agencies, public services like schools and hospitals. And the workers in the public sector are workers as legitimately and fully as workers in private firms. It's not that the private sector creates the wealth and the public sector spends the wealth. Far from it. People who work in public sector settings like universities and schools and hospitals and community agencies are producing value added with their labor, absolutely, and it counts in GDP. But they, even though they're in the public sector, face many of the same challenges as people who work in the private sector from employers who obviously tell them what to do, own the value added that they produce, and dispose of those workers when they're not required. So I've tried to be in my work, very inclusive. For sure, there are differences in the types of work that people do and cultural differences, and people might not think of themselves this way. But the reality is 85% of Canadians over their life cycle have to work for someone else for a living to support themselves. And once we start thinking of ourselves as the 85%, I tend to think that some of the debates that we have in Canada over the direction of our economy will go very differently. So I talked about the 2% roughly of Canadians who work in a business setting but are not the actual workers. And by this, I'm referring to the owners and top managers of those private firms that account for about 85% of total output in our economy, in our GDP. Now, it's hard to, there's some subtleties or nuances in how we try to define this group of people who are running and managing and owning the firms that other people work for, where most of the work is done by wage laborers, by paid employees. But the people who own those companies and direct those companies are making a living off those firms, and they cannot really be called workers. They may be the ones who own the company. They may be the top managers and directors of the company. Many of them do work, and this is important to recognize. So if you're a hands-on owner of a business, you're kind of going into the office, you're monitoring production, you're trying to hire the right staff, you're trying to solve problems, you're ordering supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So that is actual work. The work of management and coordination in the broad sense is absolutely productive human labor, and it is essential, and we need it to be done well. Sometimes it isn't done well, and we see that entire companies get into trouble as a result. On the other hand, there are also some people who own businesses but do not work in them, and they can own the businesses either directly as their own firm, or they can own it indirectly through their ownership of company shares and stocks and other financial assets. About 2% of Canadians have enough financial wealth invested that they don't have to work. They could have a very decent living, a high standard of living without having to work. Many of them do, particularly if they own their own companies, but they aren't compelled to work in order to survive. And that makes them different from the rest of us. And that small group of Canadians owns the controlling interest in the private business sector that undertakes 85% of the production in our economy. There's also a large overlap between this group of wealth owners who don't have to work and the people who are the top executives of the large private companies that hire wage labor to do most of their work. in fact, nowadays in a modern corporation, you are an owner when you're a top manager. They always pay the top managers, the CEOs, but the next couple of tiers of directors, they always pay them in part through stock options and other forms of equity-based compensation to ensure that those top managers are also owners. And the reason they do that is to get them to act and think like owners, and put absolute focus on maximizing the profits of those businesses. So if I've defined the working class in Canada today as the 85% of people who have to undertake wage labor to support themselves over their lifestyle, I would define the capitalist class, if we can use that term, less pejoratively. I would call them the major owners and top managers of society. I would define them as the roughly 2% of Canadians who own enough wealth that they don't have to work. They largely live off the profits of businesses that are run on the basis of wage labor of others. Many of them do work as owners, managers, top directors of private companies, but they don't have to, and that is a fundamental difference when you don't have to engage in that work for survival. And the statistics suggest there are about 2% of Canadians who own something like $2 million or more of financial wealth, which is enough to live a very comfortable life forever without having to work, given the rates of return that you can make on that. Interesting, I zeroed in on 2% as the number there. I don't know if folks remember, 10 years ago, there was this great upsurge of protest around the world called the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement started in New York with some protesters who took over a park in Wall Street area, and then it spread to other countries around the world, including Canada. And they had a great slogan, which was the 1% versus the 99%. And they said, we are the 99%, referring to the people who work for a living and also including self-employed people, and highlighting the differences between the 1% and the 99%. In my research, I think it's actually 2% versus 98%. But of course, that doesn't make for nearly as good of a slogan. And that's why I work in the economics department, not the marketing department. I think it's the 2% and the 98% rather than the 1% and the 99%. Either way, it's a very small proportion of people who own enough money that they don't have to work and who own the controlling interest of the companies that produce most of the goods and services in our economy. Now, I know some people are going to be thinking, well, we all own the companies through our mutual funds and our pension funds and the stock market, etc. We'll have a chance in the next week's lecture and then later on when we talk about the financial sector to talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. The reality is over half of business wealth in Canada is owned by that 2% of the population. Okay, so we've got the workers, we've got the capitalists, our major owners and top managers. We've got a group of self-employed people who are somewhere in between them. Let's talk about how it all comes together and how output is produced. In goes labor, in goes capital, in goes all the raw materials, and out comes the output at the other end. And I put a lot of attention in my economic research and teaching into the production process and getting into it and taking a look at it and understanding it and understanding what it means for society and how the economy functions. And this is unusual in economics. So if you are taking a conventional economics class at a university, you would have a production almost treated as an afterthought. I can literally tell you it is treated as if it's a mathematical formula. There's a thing in economics called the production function, where Q, held to represent the quantity of output, equals some function of K representing capital, K representing capital, and L representing labor. And then they put some kind of parameters and different functional forms. A famous one is called a Cobb-Douglas production function, but there's other more complicated ones. And all they do is they're saying through mathematics, you put in labor, you put in capital, and out comes output, just like it's a black box or a mathematical function. And in reality, anyone who has worked for a living knows full well it isn't a black box. It's a lot more complicated. It's a lot less predictable. It's a lot less automatic. How production is organized, how work occurs, who tells who to do what, and what it all means. And it's much more complicated than a simple mathematical function, and it's much more complicated in social terms, in terms of the differences between people fulfilling different roles in the process. And in particular, the fact that there are 85% of people who have to work for a living for someone else who tells them what to do, and there are 2% of the population who tell others what to do, either directly as top directors or indirectly as major owners. That division between society explains a lot about how work occurs in workplaces and about how society unfolds beyond it. So the features of the employment relationship in an economic system where employment is the dominant form of work, those features are important to explain how the economy unfolds. Now, if you've ever studied economics at university, this is something that you will have seen ad nauseum, time and time again, in terms of how they understand how employment works. Production is just a black box. All you have to do is add labor and capital, and out comes output. And by the way, how is employment determined? Well, it's an automatic function as well. This is a conventional supply and demand depiction of the labor market, of how both employment and wages are determined. I won't spend too much time on it. Many of you will have seen this before, but there's a labor demand line that goes down. That's the mnemonic device. Demand goes down. I learned that in my first year of economics, and I still use that mnemonic device in my head. There's a labor supply curve that goes up. The reason labor demand goes down is, in theory, employers will hire less labor if they have to pay more for it. The reason labor supply goes up, in theory, workers will be more willing to work if they get paid better for it. And in the magical world of a free market economic model, those two lines will cross. And where they cross is a point of nirvana, or perhaps economic ecstasy, where supply equals demand, and the intersection of those two lines determines how many people are employed and what they're paid for. And when you dig deeper into this traditional neoclassical theory of economics, we introduced neoclassical theory last week. You dig deeper, there's other wonderful things that happen. Not only is there never unemployment because supply equals demand, but the amount that people get paid is tied directly to their productivity, or their marginal productivity, to be more precise. And this, of course, is an idealized world, but it's one where conventional economists say, get government out of the way. Let the markets do what they do. Let employers try to optimize their profits. And if people want to work, they'll work and they'll get hired. The market will make sure of it. If they don't want to work, fine, don't work. Find some other way to support themselves. And government may come in and try to adjust this because they don't like how low the wage is, for example. But if they try to do that by pushing up the wage above that market clearing nirvana point, they're actually going to mess things up. The unintended consequences of government intervention in free markets are unemployment, because if you push the wage higher than that level, well, more people will come in and look for work, and employers will hire fewer because they're quote unquote too expensive. This isn't remotely how the labor market operates in the real world, but this is how it's taught, and this is how even a lot of politicians think. So in Ontario, for example, this week they increased the minimum wage. At least they have a minimum wage. They increased it by 10 cents, 10 whole cents an hour, from $14.25 an hour to $14.35 an hour. Workers, don't spend it all in one place. Okay, take your 10 cents, save it up for an entire week's work if you're full time, and you can go and buy a coffee at Starbucks. Okay. So anyways, it's a ridiculously small, kind of almost insulting increase in the minimum wage. And why? Well, the government in Ontario these days is a government that doesn't believe in higher minimum wages. They think that it discourages employment, and it's better to keep the wage low. So they are informed by a simple vision of the labor market that looks something like this. I, on the other hand, and others who have a more sort of critical or heterodox approach to economics, zero in on the labor process. We don't treat it as a black box. We look at it as a social process, a complicated process, and a conflictual process where humans engage in interactions with each other in the workplace. You're always working with other people. Even if you work physically by yourself, you're still working in a social organization. And in that model, there's lots of decisions and impacts from the fact that some people are working for other people who tell them what to do. And that inherent power imbalance between workers and their owners slash top directors explains a lot in society, including how the pie is shared, including income distribution. It isn't a process of market clearing at all that determines how wages and income levels are set. It's all about power and institutions and regulations. And for all kinds of reasons, that basic supply and demand graph is not a good explanation of how employment actually works. So reasons why we want a more, I would say, nuanced and rich analysis of the labor market and how it operates. First of all, the labor market does not clear, even if government got out of the way and got rid of minimum wages and got rid of all those other regulations. The labor market is almost never in a situation where supply equals demand and the economy ran out of workers. In our history, it's only happened once, and that was during World War II, when the government was pumping huge resources into the war effort, and we literally did run out of workers. And then we went and recruited women who were already working at home, of course, more of them to come and work in the paid formal labor market to help with the war effort. And it was all driven by an enormous government plan, not by free markets. That's the one and only time in Canada's history that we've actually had zero unemployment. In all other times, we've had some unemployment, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but unemployment is a normal feature of the labor market in our economy. Moreover, the wage itself does not clear the labor market. The fluctuations in the wage, contrary to that supply and demand graph, are not sufficient to ensure that supply equals demand. First of all, there's no predictable relationship between supply and demand and the level of prices. It is not the case automatically that a higher wage means less employment. That's a myth. Sometimes a higher wage can lead to more employment. The reason being, workers who earn a higher wages have more money to spend, and the resulting increase in consumer demand encourages businesses to hire more people. Same goes for labor supply. There are ways in which people don't necessarily supply more labor when the wage is high. It could be that they have a target income in mind, a certain standard of living that they'd like to meet. And if the wage is higher, they can meet that standard of living without working as much. And therefore, at higher levels of wages, their labor supply will actually drop. And there's evidence to show that that's true in certain cases. So this idea of predictable supply and demand graphs and a wage that ensures that they always meet just does not happen in the real world. It's not just that unemployment is a normal feature of the economy, of the labor market. In fact, unemployment is a desired and deliberate feature of the labor market. And this sounds crazy when you're saying it, but the reality is that governments, and in particular the government's central bank in Canada, that's the Bank of Canada, actually manage the economy to maintain a certain desired level of unemployment. Why? They think that if unemployment falls too low, workers will feel too uppity and confident, wages will grow too high, and we'll have a problem with lower profits and higher inflation. So the reality is that the economy is managed in order to maintain a certain level of unemployment. What Milton Friedman, the founder of neoclassical economics, neoliberal economics, he called it the natural rate of unemployment, but it isn't natural. It's completely human caused and deliberate. Finally, this idea that the wage just reflects people's productivity is also nonsense. In reality, it's all about power and institutions and regulations that determine who gets what. And the high-priced stockbroker who takes home 7 figures a year, believe me, is not more productive than the cleaner or the retail clerk or the delivery driver. They actually produce more real value added. It's just that they aren't very powerful and therefore can't win themselves a larger share of the economic pie that they produce. So there's a market for labor. In that regard, labor is a commodity. It's bought and sold for money, but it's a unique commodity for all kinds of reasons. And when we tell the full story, we start to understand why the labor market and labor economics is so interesting and so complicated. First of all, workers are alive. They are not robots. They are not just physical commodities coming down the assembly line. Workers can think. They have feelings, and therefore their actions depend on how they feel. You can have workers resisting arrangements that they think are unfair, resisting in organized ways or unorganized ways. Labor, unlike other commodities, is not produced in the economy. It is reproduced in our families. So you can almost think of the household as a little factory that churns out workers, and that's exactly what it does. So the relationships at home, including all the unpaid labor at home, are important in understanding how labor occurs. So in this regard, labor is produced through the act of consumption. When households buy food, clothing, shelter, and all the other essentials of life, though they're being consumers, but the act of consuming is actually producing more labor. But at the same time, how is labor actually used up? Well, nobody hires a labor just to stand around and just stand around and look good, or hire a broom, hold a broom. People hire workers in order to produce. So the production of labor occurs through consumption, and the consumption of labor occurs through production. Nobody uses labor unless production is occurring. And this is really important because unlike other commodities, you don't just hire it for its own sake. The demand for labor is derived from the demand for the things that labor produces. And this is why, in particular, the idea that just making workers cheaper will automatically mean more of them are hired is wrong. It all depends on the demand for the things that workers produce. The labor market never clears, as we've discussed, and there are many different labor markets. People with similar characteristics and qualities can be paid very, very differently depending on what niche of the labor market they're in, what industry they work in, what region they live in, what ethnic group they come from. This is a really important one around thinking about production. What the purchaser buys, usually they're paying for a certain amount of your time, an hour of your labor or a week of your work. What they're buying, what the employer is buying, is different from what they want. Again, they don't hire you just to sit there. They hire you to work, and they want that labor effort. And going from time to effort is an ongoing obsession of employers. Employers are always trying to get more bang for the buck and convert what they're buying, the time of the workers, into what they actually want, which is the actual effort that the workers are undertaking. The term we use for this is the labor extraction problem. Employers and managers are always thinking about new ways to try to get workers to work harder, faster, better, so that they can convert the money they've spent on their time, their wages and salaries that are paid, into actual delivered high-quality labor effort. And we'll talk about that issue of labor extraction. Employers, remember, 85% of production is private employers who are producing something to sell it for a profit. How can they get more profit? Well, they can get more profit in large part by reducing the costs of production. And what they're particularly interested in terms of labor is how to minimize what we call the unit labor cost of output. That's not just a matter of reducing wages and compensation. It's also a matter of boosting productivity and the intensity and efficiency of work. In other words, converting purchased labor time into expended labor effort. And the productivity is just as important as the wages there. If we think of unit labor cost as the total amount of compensation paid to workers relative to how much they produced, you can see that employers are interested in both sides of those fractions, both sides of that fraction. They want to reduce the total cost that they pay labor, but they also want to get more bang for the buck in terms of output and productivity. And that interest, that struggle of employers to try and limit cost and increase output means that workplaces tend to be inherently conflictual. even if the manager is a good person, even if they use the latest and most subtle forms of communication and motivation and treat the workers like one of the family, there's still an inherent source of economic conflict because of those different interests at play. The employer is interested in maximizing their own profit, which means they want faster, harder, longer days of work and pay for lower wages. The workers, on the other hand, want better wages, a decent standard of living, safe conditions, and time off to enjoy their life. There are ways in which these two can work together, for sure. There are ways in which their interests can coincide, particularly for a particular individual company. Workers can have an interest in making sure that company does well so that their job is secure. But there's also an underlying inherent conflict of interest between employers who would like you to reduce their unit labor costs. That means less compensation and higher productivity. Generally, in terms of managing that production process, getting into that black box and thinking about what's going on in there, employers will use a mixture of carrots and sticks. Carrots being the positive incentives for people to work harder and do better work and be loyal. Sticks are the negative punishments or constraints that are imposed on people who don't perform adequately. And employers will try to get the maximum intensity and effort and attention from their workers in the course of trying to boost overall productivity. Now, you can get a certain amount of productivity by making work more intense, okay, by cracking the whip, by speeding up the assembly line, by making sure employees are monitored and scrutinized. On the other hand, there's only so much that you can get out of people by cracking the whip. Intensity only goes so far. And employers who really want to boost productivity kind of have to look at deeper measures that we would call true efficiency here, deeper measures to improve the fundamental efficiency of labor as it goes forward, things like new capital equipment or higher value products and so on. So intensity is something that employers are concerned with, and they do try to maximize it. But intensity alone isn't going to do the trick. In places that are interested in really boosting productivity on a sustained basis in ways that can contribute to a higher standard of living, have to be looking at investments in new technology, new products, higher value products. So basically, employers treat workers the way that a farmer treats a donkey. You always know you need the carrot and the stick, the positive incentive and the negative inducement. And we see a mixture of the two all the time. And the judgment of employers as to how much to use positive incentive versus negative punishments depends on all kinds of things, including labor laws. Are employers free to fire people who they don't think are performing well, or are they constrained to go through an eight-step disciplinary process before they can fire them? If employers are freer to fire workers, then there's no doubt they're going to be more interested in using the stick. Similar issue, how much does it cost to use the stick? This is an interesting one because in the olden days, if you wanted to have a sort of a more scrutinized, intense workplace, you usually had to hire some mean SOBs to act as the foreman, as they're called, or the immediate shop floor supervisors. These are people who are workers. They're paid by the boss, but they're paid to boss around other workers, and they aren't always the most effective at eliciting more output, and they cost money because you have to pay for their salaries. So what if we could find an app or a technology or a digital tool that can do the scrutinizing instead of having to hire mean people to be the shop floor supervisors? Well, then the stick becomes cheaper. And in fact, you might use it more. And in fact, we see that right now with all the digital tools of surveillance and performance monitoring, whether that's GPS chips to track where you are at any point in time at work, or video cameras, or digital performance monitoring. So the balance between carrots and sticks is an interesting and changing balance, and different things, including more freedom for employers to fire people, and more digital technology to allow cheaper and more omnipresent forms of supervision are part of it. How would employers try to minimize unit labor costs? Well, they would try to reduce the wages and salaries that they pay. They would try to reduce the pensions and other benefits that they pay. They might try to get more hours of work out of their core workforce, particularly workers in sort of permanent jobs with normal benefits, jobs with benefits. They'll be asked to work full-time hours or even more than full-time hours, even overtime, as a way of reducing the hourly costs of those benefits. On the other hand, another approach, and sometimes employers use both, is they try to hire workers without benefits and without the sort of predictable normal jobs. And this is where we get the growth of precarious or non-standard jobs, and even these days gigs, because those workers don't get benefits, and therefore they can be hired and fired without a lot of cost. They could find employers can find places offshore or outsourced suppliers to do the job instead of their own employees if they think that's cheaper. Ways to increase the intensity of work, okay, the labor extraction issue, converting paid time into actual output, all kinds of ways to make the workplace more so-called efficient, speed up the assembly line, more monitoring, as I mentioned, reduce time spent not working, like cutting lunch breaks or expecting people to work through lunch, reducing their paid time off, asking people to work overtime without paying them. That's a very, very common thing, particularly in salaried jobs, of course, where the job is designed in a way that you really can't do it in normal working hours, and people are expected to come in early or work through lunch or take work home or be available for calls and emails on the weekend. Our research at the Center for Future Work suggests about 5 hours a week is the average amount of unpaid overtime that people do, which is another way of, again, reducing unit labor costs. If we were really going to be interested in trying to improve efficiency and lift value added in a sustainable way without just cracking the whip harder, there's lots of things that could be done. Investment in new technology, ways that make the jobs easier to do by ergonomic design or machine assistance in jobs that we're doing, simply producing higher value and more innovative products rather than low-cost widgets and so on. That's how you really develop and improve productivity in the long run and reduce unit labor costs. It's amazing that one of the countries that has reduced unit labor costs the most over the last generation has been a place like Germany. Not because they were cracking the whip like you see in many workplaces in North America, but because they were investing in technology and producing higher value products, which means you're getting more output, more value per hour, but not necessarily by intensifying and degrading the working conditions. Now, in terms of this relationship that goes on within the black box, there's a sort of fundamental asymmetry at play there. Workers and bosses do need each other, but they need each other in different ways, and they have different degrees of bargaining power that they bring to the relationship. From an individual worker's point of view, generally they either have to work or they're going to experience economic hardship. Work or starve would be the kind of ultimate extreme of this logic. Now, luckily in Canada, we generally don't let people starve, but there's more hunger than you would think, even in a place like Canada. We have a safety net, but it's a pretty bare bones safety net. So the compulsion on an individual worker is to find and keep a job, or else they and their family are going to suffer enormous hardship. Employers have a different cost-benefit situation that they face. They do not need any particular individual worker unless you're Steve Jobs, or Wayne Gretzky, or someone with a completely irreplaceable skill or attribute. Most of us are disposable. That's the sad truth. Despite the self-help books that tell us we're all important, we're all unique, from the employer's perspective, we generally aren't. And if we just go as an individual to the employer and say, I'd like a better wage, I'd like benefits, I'd like more stability, the employer usually can say, I don't need you. I'll find someone else who's willing to do it at the old rate. In aggregate, employers do need workers because they're the ones who do the work. 85% of Canadians are the wage laborers, and without wage laborers, production will not occur. And that means businesses won't survive. In a collective sense, employers need the workforce, but they don't need workers as an individual. And what that means is, as an individual, your bargaining power with your employer is limited. Unless you've got a very, very unique attribute, it is unlikely that you, as one individual, could go to your employer and say, I want something better, and actually negotiate with your employer as an individual. So just as a very, very, very quick thought experiment and a chance to kind of shoot something into the Q&A here, I want those of you who have worked at some point, many of you are not working now if you're retired, but most of you worked at some point in your lives for someone else. I'd like to have a think back, and did you ever have a situation where you as an individual went to your employer and asked for a raise? In the kind of neoclassical vision where the economy is a big market and when there's supply and demand and we all go and make a mutually agreeable trade, okay, this is something that should happen all the time. If you think you're more productive or you think there's a better option elsewhere. I think it's actually quite rare, but I'd like to hear from you. Throw a short answer into the chat, and not the chat, sorry, the Q&A function at the bottom. Did you ever ask your employer for a raise? If not, why not? Perhaps, probably because you were worried they'd fire you. If you did ask for a raise, just one-on-one, how did it go? And I'll be interested to hear your experiences. We'll take a quick peek at those when we get to the end of the lecture. The fundamental asymmetry in the employment relationship between those who work for a living and those who hire the rest of us can be fixed if we can find a way, and this is where my trade union roots are going to come to the fore. If we can find a way to go to the employers and impose a cost of disagreement on them that forces employers to take workers' demands seriously, and not just because you're one individual who might quit and go somewhere else, that's about the biggest threat you can make. And in most cases, you're replaceable. If you can go and say, listen, it's not just me, it's all of us. We need something better here, or else you're going to experience some kind of cost of disagreement, potentially even including a work stoppage. Then that fundamental asymmetry in the bargaining position between the two sides can be addressed. And workers figured this out very early in the history of capitalism and very early in the history of the wage labor system, because the people who are working 12 or 14-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week in the sweatshops of the Industrial Revolution figured out if they all stopped work, then the employer's power would be undermined and counteracted. And for that very reason, efforts to do that were banned. They were illegal, they were suppressed, they were often violently suppressed. So people who tried to organize the early unions or syndicates were thrown in jail or worse. Some of them were killed. And the argument was always, you're interfering with free competition. That was the argument. You're somehow interrupting the normal supply and demand forces which should affect an efficient labor market. Eventually, workers campaigned and fought and advocated and won the right to exist legally, although unions are still constrained in what they are able to do, the rules that they have to go through to form a union, to negotiate, to go through all of the different hoops that are required before you ever have a work stoppage, and then in many cases, just ordered back to work when the work stoppage occurs. So unions and collective bargaining are still policed with the goal of limiting the power of workers to demand something better in that workplace. In my research, I would argue that unless that fundamental asymmetry in the employment relationship is addressed and counterbalanced through some kind of collective bargaining process, you will never achieve a society of what I would call mass prosperity, where the majority of society, the majority of working people have a decent standard of living. With a bit of security, the ability to send their kids to university, and some of the other things that we associate in Canada with a middle class lifestyle. That will never be delivered to the majority of people in an economy unless there's some capacity through collective bargaining and backed up by other regulations like minimum wages to ensure that the power imbalance between employers and individual employees is offset. So when it's one-on-one with your employer, and I'll be interested to see the answers in the Q&A, you don't have much of a chance. But if you get together and offset that imbalance through collective bargaining supported by some of those other factors, then you have a chance. Time is my enemy here, so I'm going to quickly skip through some of the next slides about unions and wages. I do want to have a little bit of discussion about Canada's labor market, a bit of a statistical introduction to our labor market, and just kind of introduce some of the concepts that are related to employment and wages and so on. And those slides that I skipped through are in the file that we've posted on the website if anyone wants to take a bit of time to go through them. I apologize for running out of time. A great source of data on Canada's labor market is the Statistics Canada services. They put out a monthly survey of the labor force on employment and unemployment, and lots of other catalogs on earnings, wages, unionization, so on. Some of the main sort of aggregate numbers that we would look at if we were to describe Canada's labor market. This is going to use 2019 data because the pandemic came along and really disrupted our labor market. So as a sort of normal situation, I want to look at some of the aggregates for Canada in 2019. There were 30.7 million Canadians considered to be of working age, and Statistics Canada counts everyone over 15 as being of working age. So that working age population, a little bit over 30 million. Of that, about 2/3 of them, 20 million, 20.1 million in 2019 are in the labor force, which means they're either working or actively seeking work. And of them, 19 million were employed in 2019. Most of them, slightly over 80% in full-time jobs, 19% in part-time. Now, if you consider unemployment, how we measure unemployment in this system is we take the labor force, not the total population, but just those who are in the labor force, and subtract the amount of employment. And that created unemployment of 1.1%, which in 2019 was equal to 5.7% of the labor force. So this is important here. In order to be counted as officially unemployed in these statistics, it's not just that you're not working. You have to be not working, not even a single hour, and actively seeking work. That means putting in several applications a week looking for jobs. You can't even be passive and say, I'm just looking at the want ads or looking at the online job sites. You have to be actively applying for work to count as actively seeking it. And then you're in the labor force. If you're not actively seeking it, then you're not considered to be in the labor force. And then you're not considered to be unemployed. It's a very artificial distinction, and it means that the unemployment rate is quite inaccurate as a measure of true unemployment. An important issue that we measure is called the participation rate, which is the proportion of the working age population that is in the labor force. And as I mentioned, in Canada, it was about 2/3, 65.6% of working age Canadians were either working or actively seeking work. And more participation in general is a good thing. There's still a big gender gap in participation, although it has been narrowing in recent years as women's labor force participation has increased. And other factors that affect participation, including how old the labor market is. Because obviously, if you're over 15 but you're 80, you're not likely to be in the labor force. So the aging of society has pushed down the average participation rate. The last statistic I'll introduce there is what's called the employment rate. The employment rate, in my judgment, is often a better indicator of how well the labor market is doing than the unemployment rate. And in this case, it was about 63%. The employment rate doesn't care whether you're actively seeking work or not. What it does is it measures whether you're working or not. And I think because of that artificial restriction that you have to be putting in several applications a week, otherwise you're not considered unemployed, the employment rate is actually a better description.